Welcome to Module 7. There's only one more module to go after this one, 8 modules altogether in the course, so we're nearly there. And let's get started with rules and reefing. Rules, well, we're talking about the road rules for the water, if you like, a bit like the road code. With reefing, that's talking about how can we make the sails smaller. So if we're sailing in a storm, we might have too much sail area up. We can make our sails smaller, and that would be really helpful in terms of keeping control of the boat. Let's have a look at the rules first. So the rules of boating are an international set of regulations called the RNZYS, International Regulations for the Prevention of Collisions. And in the most part, they rely on which boat is most maneuverable. So if you're on the most maneuverable boat, then you're probably the one that has to give way. In the situation where we have a power boat and a sailing boat in a crossing situation, it would normally be the power boat that gives way. And that's simply because the person driving the power boat doesn't need to think about which way the wind's coming and where their sails need to be. All they've got is a throttle. The other thing is that with a sailing boat, we've normally got a long keel sticking out the bottom of it, so we have to be cautious about the depth of water as well. So there's a bit more for us to consider. There's a bit more limitations on the directions that we can sail in, but a power boat can go any direction and doesn't need as much water. So they would normally be considered the most maneuverable boat, and that's why for most of the time power boats give way to sailing boats. There are a few exceptions to that. There are occasions when sailing boats have to give way to power boats, and we will come to that. But the RNZYS really rely on who can give way the easiest. And it's an international set of regulations. So if you learn to sail here in New Zealand and you go to Australia or maybe even to Europe, you'll find that the actual rules and what you need to do and how you pass people, how you avoid collisions are the same throughout the world. There might be a few local variations, local laws, but the RNZYS are internationally recognised. So we need to have a look at some vocabulary. As always with these modules, there's a few more words that we need to learn. Now, one side of the boat is the starboard side, that's the right-hand side, and the left-hand side of the boat is the port side. Where starboard came from is because when we first started sailing, we used to have a steering board over the right-hand side of the boat. We had it on the right-hand side because most of us are right-handed, and we were strong in that arm. Now, if we had our steering on the right-hand side, we had to go onto the port, onto the dock, on the left-hand side of the boat. And that's, I believe, where port came from. Some people might remember port as there's a little bit of port left in the bottle, a little bit of port left in the bottle. But starboard, I believe, came from steering board. After years, that became starboard, and it was the right-hand side of the boat. POSH, for a bonus question, bonus quiz, is also a nautical term. POSH stands for port out, starboard home. And if you were wealthy and you were getting on the Titanic, you might have POSH written on your ticket. And it wasn't a social slur, that just meant that the cabin crew had to switch you from one side of the boat to the other side, depending on which one had the better view. Normally that would be the port side when you were leaving the dock and the starboard side when you were coming back home. You got the nice view out of your window. So POSH, nautical term, not part of level 1 learn to sail, just threw that in for a bit of general knowledge maybe. The other words that we need to know are windward and leeward. Well, in this instance, the side of the boat that sees the wind first is the starboard side, and we would call that the windward side. The leeward side, or the leeward side, would be the port hand side of the boat. And that's simply when the wind blows, if it hits the port side, that is the windward side. In this instance, though, it's the starboard side that feels the wind first. The port side does get the wind pass over it, but the starboard side sees it first. So starboard side in this orientation is the windward side of the boat, and then the leeward side is the other side. So windward, leeward, starboard and port, they're the main terms that we're going to need to get our head around for understanding who gives way and who is stand on. So here we have a very symmetrical lake, part A and part B. We want to get our boat into the windward side of the lake. And which bit is the windward side of the lake? Well, it's pretty straightforward. A is the closest part of the lake to the wind. B would be the leeward part. So next we have an exploding rock, and we have a sailing boat on one side and a powerboat on the other. So which vessel is windward of the rock and which one is leeward of the rock? And yep, the sailing boat is on the windward side, the powerboat is on the leeward side. So there are some speed limits which we need to consider. From the harbour bridge, which you can see over my shoulder here with the blue lights on, from that bridge up to North Head, there's a 12-knot speed limit. It only really applies to powerboats because sailing boats will have a job to exceed 12 knots on our sailing course anyway. But there are other situations where we need to be careful of our speed. And that is when we come across other boats, when we're close to land, when we're close to rocks, when there's swimmers, dive boats or kayaks. The Coast Guard often refer to kayakers as judder bars because people kayaking are really hard to see. If they're not wearing full high-vis gear and have a flag, unfortunately they get run over a lot. And we need to be really careful about that. We need to not hurt people when we're out sailing. So we need to keep a safe speed at all times and not be out of control. We might want to consider reducing speed if we can't see where we're going, for instance, or if there's really heavy traffic. In particular with speed, we must not exceed 5 knots. If we're within 200 metres of shore, any structure or boat that's displaying a dive flag, and that's because we've got somebody under the water and they don't know what's going on the surface, and they could pop up at any time, and we don't want to hit them at speed. We want to give them every opportunity to not come up near us. So if we're within 200 metres of them, we need to slow the boat down to 5 knots. Also, if we're within 50 metres of any other boat or a person swimming, we need to slow down and make sure we don't collide with them. Big ships. Now, this is quite a common sight in Auckland. This is actually an insert or a little photograph that we've taken from the Auckland chart. This is North Head here, and that's the main shipping lane leaving the port of Auckland. Now, any vessel within this lane must give way to the big ships. They are restricted to this shipping lane. They cannot move out of it. If they do, they're going to get stuck. The other thing to bear in mind is that they are deceptively fast. Sometimes, you might think you've got time to cross, and then suddenly they're on top of you. They can't slow down very easily. If they shift into reverse, even go full reverse, it might take them 1 or 2 miles before they can stop. They have a very small rudder. They're not designed to be very maneuverable. They're designed to shift large amounts of cargo over large distances, and they don't need to do sharp turns. So they would find it very difficult to avoid us. So we need to give way to them. And the rule is that anything over 500 tonnes, we need to stay 500 metres clear of ahead and 200 meters off either side or the stern. Now that's quite difficult to judge. I certainly don't know what 500 tons look like. Well, actually I do. There's a picture. That boat there is more than 500 tons. This small tug is not over 500 tons. So if it's bigger than the tug, it may well be over 500 tons and we probably need to keep away from it. But yeah, it's a little bit difficult to imagine what that is. But I know that this cargo ship here is well over 500 tons. So we also need to keep to the starboard side of the channel. Now, with sailing boats, that's not always easy to do because, you know, if we're sailing upwind, we might have to zigzag to get upwind. If we're motoring, though, it would be expected of us that we would be traveling out of the marina on the starboard side and coming back on the starboard side. So that's the right-hand side relative to us, whether we're going out or coming in. We need to respect those give way rules. Power does give way to sail most of the time, but there are a number of issues or a number of instances when power boats don't need to give way to us. So if they're really big, if they're over 500 tons, we are expected to get out of their way because we are more maneuverable than them. If a boat is towing another boat, that may well impede their maneuverability. That means they're restricted in maneuverability. We teach you more about that on our level 2 cruising course. But if they're restricted in their maneuverability, we need to give way to them. Now, if two sailing boats are coming together, then we need to think about who's on port and who's on starboard. This time, that's not an exploding rock. That's where the collision is going to happen. This boat here, we can see that the wind is touching the starboard side first. So we'll say that this is the starboard boat. The wind on this boat comes across the port side, the left-hand side of the boat first. So this is the port boat. And port gives way to starboard. So the starboard vessel would be the stand-on vessel. And that means that they have an obligation to maintain their course and speed. And the port boat has got a couple of options that it can do. It can't continue. That red line there is what it can't do. Either one of these blue lines would be acceptable. So it could tack and go in the same direction. It could bear away and come around behind the other boat, but it can't carry straight on. Now, one really important thing is that there may be some times when there's an issue on this boat and they can't turn and avoid us. It might be that they haven't seen us. It might be that they have a mechanical issue on the boat. So while this boat has, the starboard boat has an obligation to maintain its course and heading, if it's obvious that the port boat is not giving way, then the owner switches back onto the starboard boat to give way and avoid that collision. The number one rule in boating is avoid collisions. Now, that's a really sensible rule because if we have a hole in our boat, then we're swimming home. And we don't want holes in our boats. We don't want to have the cost of repairing that. We don't want to have to swim home. So we need to avoid collisions at all costs. Being the stand-on vessel means that you keep to the same course, you keep your same speed, and you observe what the giveaway vessel is doing. If they're making no effort to turn, then we need to do something. The port boat shouldn't make small incremental movements because the starboard boat won't be able to see those. It needs to make a really big gesture so it's obvious that they are intending to come round behind the other boat or turn the other way. So it needs to be big movements that are pretty obvious for everybody what their intentions are. Here we've got some sailing boats that are on the same tack. So the hierarchy in the rules, if you like, is avoid collisions, then port and starboard, And then when we get onto boats that are on the same tack, it matters which one sees the wind first. Now, if we take this group of boats, this boat here would be the windward boat. That boat would be the give way boat, and the leeward boat is the stand-on vessel. And that's because the windward boat is more maneuverable. It's more maneuverable because it sees the wind first. There's a big wind shadow on the other side of it, which means that the boat below it, or the leeward boat, is not quite as maneuverable. So the windward boat has more opportunity to keep clear than the leeward boat does. So the leeward boat can carry on. The windward boat can't come down onto the leeward boat. It needs to maintain its course and not impede this boat. In this situation, when we've got a boat traveling upwind and a boat coming downwind, it's the same deal. This is the windward boat. If they're on the same tack, then the windward boat needs to give way. If they're on opposite tacks, if this boat is on starboard and this one's on port, that's not the case, but if that was the case, then port starboard would apply, and whoever was on starboard would have right of way. But if the boats are on the same tack, let's explore that. Here we've got the boat, sails on the port side, wind on the starboard side, so that's the starboard boat. Here, that's the left-hand side. The right-hand side of the boat gets the wind first, so starboard side. So both vessels are on starboard tack. This boat traveling downwind is the windward boat. So the leeward boat has right of way. The only issue to point out here is that this boat has got a big downwind sail. It's a Jenica, and that sail won't go upwind. So this maneuver, that boat won't be able to do. This one it can't do because it needs to avoid the collision. This is its only option, really, to come round behind. The other thing to note is that this is a really big sail, and if the people driving it are sitting on that starboard side, they won't be able to see you very well. So while they may have every intention of giving way to the boats that are coming upwind, they may not know that you're there. So the people sailing this boat should be very alert and keep an eye on this boat and make sure they are attempting to avoid the collision. We must avoid a collision at all costs. So here we've got two boats. One boat is overtaking the other. And in terms of sailing boats, they're both on the same tack. So the wind is coming over the left-hand side this time. So they're on the port tack. Wind hits the port side first, so that's port tack for both of them. And the one behind wants to overtake. The one behind must give way, and it can go either side of the boat. Now, no sailor is going to come underneath. We want to go above. We want to be between the wind and that boat. And the reason for that is when we get into this position here, our wind shadow will slow that boat down and we'll be able to get past it quicker. Now, this situation is a sailing boat overtaking a power boat. And I did say earlier that power gives way to sail most of the time. And this is one of the occasions where the sailing boat has to give way. Overtaking boats give way, irrespective of whether they're power boats or sailing boats. The overtaking boat has to give way. And this actually came up during the America's Cup, where American Magic were coming back to the base from the race course, and they were actually overtaking a ferry. And there was very nearly a collision, and it was all caught on video, and that video made its way to the harbour master. And the harbour master had a chat with American Magic and gave them a fine. I think it was only a couple of $100, so it didn't really affect our America's Cup campaign, but it was an example of a very fast sailing boat that should have given way to a powerboat, but didn't, and it got a fine for doing that. So sailing boats definitely have to give way to powerboats in some situations. Usually it's the powerboat that gives way, but there are occasions like when we're overtaking, or when the boat is really big, or when it's restricted in its maneuverability, that the sailing boat has to give way. And just to make sure everybody understood, avoiding that collision is the #1 rule. Yes, we need to make early and obvious maneuvers so that there's no confusion as to who is giving way. And if the other boat doesn't give way, that's not an excuse to plow into the side of it. We need to avoid it. We can shout at them and call them names and report them to the harbour master for driving their boat dangerously if we want to, but we, under no circumstances can we afford to have a hole in our boat. Right, so that's the end of the rules section. I really like this photo here. I mean, it's the first loser in the America's Cup. Don't know if I can call them that. Well, I did, so I can, I guess. But anyway, I just really like the sky and the sea. It looks like quite a beautiful day. Yeah, I'm quite looking forward to the next America's Cup, where I'm sure Prada will be trying to be the winner this time. And here we go on to reefing. So here we have the MRX boat, and here on the boom we can see that the sail, there's some of the sail gathered up there, and we haven't pulled it all the way up the mast, and that's how we make it smaller. With the head sail, these head sails come in different sizes. So the small one is called a jib, and then there's a bigger one that overlaps called a genoa. They generally come in 3 different sizes. So the big one would be the #1 head sail. A #2 would probably come to the mast. And a #3, which is this one, doesn't quite go to the mast. It's a little bit shorter than that. So there's 3 different head sails, and basically we just put on the sail that is suitable for the weather conditions. With the main sail, it's one size, and we just don't pull all of it up if we don't want to use it all. There's a couple of different ways we can do that. We can have it gathered on the boom. We can roll it up into the mast, which I don't tend to like boats that have sails rolled into the mast, because it tends to make the mast really heavy. We don't really want a lot of weight up high. We want the keel being really heavy, and if the keel's heavier than the mast, then we'll be the right way up. So having a light mast makes the stability of the boat much better. So I would tend to shy away from boats that have the main sail rolling up into the mast. Having the sail roll up into the boom is also a possibility, and that makes it quite nice and neat. Probably a stack pack is the easiest way, which is similar to what we've got here, where it just gathers up on the bottom. There's less mechanical things to go wrong. It's a much cheaper, simpler design. Head sails also can roll around the forestay, and that's really useful in a cruising boat, to be able to roll that sail up or just roll out whatever we want to use. So there are a few options. On the MRX, we've got 3 different head sails. There's 1, a big one, #2, and a #3. With the main sail, we've just got the 1, and we don't need to pull it all up if we don't want to. So yeah, let's have a look at the reefing system in a bit more detail. And I like that note at the bottom there that is often said that if you're thinking of putting in a reef, you already should have done it. It's much easier to put a reef in when you're on the dock. When the boat's bouncing around and the sail's flapping, it's quite hard to put a reef in. Some of those roller furling systems make that a bit easier, but it does still load up the rollers a little bit. But certainly reefing early is the way to go. You can always shake the reef out if you don't need it. So here's our nice drawing. We've got the reef line at the back of the sail on the leech, and then we've got a reef hook on the front of the boom there. And basically we just put the corresponding hole onto the hook that lines up with the reefing line. So the number 1 reef is the first one that we get to. The number 2 is the next one, and then we have the number 3. Now, if you need the 3rd reef, that's really storm survival, and you really need to check your preferences with your weather forecasting, because that 3rd reef should never be used. Really, that's really dire situation, and that's a very small sail. But certainly, if it's a little bit windy and you don't want to be overpowered, putting in the 1st reef is fine. That's a good seamanship. Going to the 2nd reef, if it's a little bit more than that, but like I say, that 3rd reef, you really shouldn't be out in the water if you need the 3rd reef. That's 40 to 50 knots, and if you have no choice, like if you're sailing from here to Australia and there happens to be 40 knot winds, well, then yeah, put the 3rd reef in, but don't be in the dock thinking it's 40 knots, let's go sailing with the 3rd reef. Just stay in the dock. So here we got the sail on the 3rd reef, and you can see that there's a lot of mast sticking out the top above the sail. So that sail is significantly smaller. Here we've got 2 little ropes. They're the little ropes that we would tie a reef knot in to gather up that sail and keep it tidy. And what we're doing here is just reducing the surface area of the sail. We're making it a much smaller. If you like, we're taking the V12 out of the Ferrari and we're sticking in the lawnmower engine, and we're not wheel spinning anymore, which might be exactly what we want to do. I know it doesn't sound much fun, but it's a lot better than losing control of the boat or breaking something, having the mast break. So dropping the sail down and reefing is exactly the right thing to do if the weather conditions mean that we should reduce surface area. The reefing system is there so that we can have a much broader range in our sailing conditions. We can have a big sail when it's light wind. When it's getting a bit strong, we can make it smaller. And we would reef after we've flattened the sail. So in the previous module, I think module 5, we talked about the sail controls and how we can flatten the sail to make it depowered. If we've done that, if we've flattened the sail and we're still overpowered, then we need to stop and we need to put the reef in and get rid of some surface area. So here we've got Ineos, Team UK. No reefing points on that boat. They had a huge sail wardrobe. So like us with our MRX having different head sails, they also had different main sails, and they just put on the sail that suited the weather conditions. Same with Team New Zealand, of course, as well, but all the teams are doing the same thing. So well done. You've reached the end of Module 7. There is a quiz for Module 7, so have a go at the quiz. And if you like your results, move on to Module 8. That's the last module in the series, and I'll see you there.